Welcome to IELTS Self-Peep MasterPrep, your trusted source for real exam-based practice tests. Every test you see here is inspired by current exam trends, and each one comes with full model solutions to help you master every section. Here's our daily schedule. IELTS tests drop every morning at 7:30 a.m. Eastern, and CLP tests every evening at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. No matter which exam you're preparing for, we've got you covered every single day. Are you ready for today's test? Give it your best shot and comment your score. The top 5 scorers will be featured in our monthly Achievers newsletter and awards. Want your name included? Let's begin.
How often do you read books, and what kind of books do you enjoy?
I read books maybe 2 or 3 times a week. I like reading novels, especially stories about adventures and mysteries. Sometimes I also read books about history because I find it quite interesting. I don't read very difficult books because I prefer to relax when I'm reading. I think reading is a good hobby for everyone.
I'd say I'm a fairly regular reader. I try to pick up a book at least 4 or 5 times a week, usually before bed. I'm particularly drawn to literary fiction and historical novels because they allow me to explore different cultures and time periods. Occasionally, I'll also delve into popular science books, as I find them quite stimulating. Reading has honestly become an essential part of my daily routine over the years.
I'm an avid reader. To be honest, I make a conscious effort to read on a daily basis, even if it's just for 20 or 30 minutes before I turn in for the night. My tastes are fairly eclectic. I gravitate towards contemporary literary fiction and philosophical essays, though I'm equally fond of well-crafted crime thrillers when I want something lighter. What appeals to me most is the way a skillfully written book can challenge your assumptions and broaden your perspective in ways that other media simply cannot replicate.
Do you prefer reading physical books or e-books? Why?
I prefer physical books because I like the feeling of holding a real book. I think it's more comfortable for my eyes too. E-books are convenient, but I don't enjoy reading on a screen for a long time. Also, I like to collect books and put them on my shelf at home. It looks nice and makes me feel good.
To be perfectly honest, I have a strong preference for physical books, mainly because there's something quite satisfying about turning actual pages and feeling the weight of a book in your hands. Having said that, I do recognize the practical advantages of ebooks. They're far more portable, and you can carry an entire library on a single device. Nevertheless, when given the choice, I'll almost always reach for a printed copy, as I find it easier to concentrate on the material.
That's an interesting question, and I'd have to say I'm somewhat torn between the two. On the one hand, I'm deeply attached to physical books. There's an almost ritualistic pleasure in browsing a bookshop, selecting a beautifully bound edition, and then savoring the tactile experience of reading it. On the other hand, I've come to appreciate the sheer convenience of e-readers, particularly when I'm traveling and luggage space is at a premium. Ultimately, though, if I had to choose one, I'd lean towards print, as I find the reading experience far more immersive and memorable.
Has the way people read changed compared to the past, do you think?
Yes, I think reading has changed a lot. Nowadays, people read more things on their phones and computers. In the past, everyone read newspapers and books. Now many young people prefer to read short articles online or on social media. I think some people read less books than before because they are busy with technology and other things.
Absolutely. I believe reading habits have undergone quite a significant transformation in recent decades. People today tend to consume far more digital content, blog posts, online articles, social media updates, rather than sitting down with a traditional book or newspaper. Moreover, attention spans seem to have shortened considerably, which means many readers now prefer bite-sized content over lengthy novels. That said, there's been a noticeable resurgence in independent bookshops recently, which suggests that physical reading hasn't disappeared entirely.
Without a doubt, the landscape of reading has been fundamentally reshaped over the past couple of decades. The proliferation of smartphones and tablets has meant that people now consume written content in a markedly different fashion. We've shifted from a culture of deep, sustained reading to one of rapid scrolling and skimming through headlines and social media feeds. Interestingly, however, this digital revolution has also democratized access to literature in unprecedented ways. E-books and audiobooks have made reading accessible to people who might previously have been excluded. So while the medium has evolved dramatically, I'd argue that the appetite for storytelling and knowledge remains as robust as ever.
Who are you closest to in your family, and why?
I'm closest to my mother because she always helps me and gives me good advice. We talk about many things together, like my studies and my future plans. She understands me very well and she is always patient with me. I also spend a lot of time with her at home, so we have a strong relationship. I think mothers are very important in everyone's life.
I'd say I'm closest to my younger sister, actually. We've always had a really strong bond, partly because there's only a 2-year age gap between us, so we essentially grew up doing everything together. What I particularly value about our relationship is that she's incredibly honest with me. She'll tell me exactly what she thinks without sugarcoating things, which I find refreshing. We make a point of catching up at least once a week, even though we now live in different cities, which I think has helped us maintain that closeness.
I would have to say that my grandmother holds a particularly special place in my heart. She practically raised me during my formative years while my parents were working abroad, and as a result, we developed an extraordinarily close bond that has only deepened with time. What I find truly remarkable about her is her unwavering resilience and her ability to approach even the most daunting challenges with grace and good humor. She's been an enormous source of inspiration for me, in many ways. The values I hold most dear, such as empathy, perseverance, and intellectual curiosity, are qualities I've absorbed from her over the years.
Do you prefer spending time with a large group of friends, or just one or two close friends?
I prefer spending time with 1 or 2 close friends. When I'm with many people, I feel a bit uncomfortable and I don't know what to say sometimes. With close friends, I can be myself and talk about anything. We usually go to a cafe or watch films together. I think it's more relaxing to be with a small group of people.
I'm definitely more of a small group person, if I'm being honest. I find that when I'm with just 1 or 2 close friends, the conversations tend to be much more meaningful and genuine. We can really open up about things that matter to us. Large gatherings can be enjoyable on occasion, particularly for celebrations or special events, but I often find them rather draining after a while. I suppose it comes down to the fact that I value depth of connection over breadth, and that's something you can only really achieve in a more intimate setting.
I've always gravitated towards spending quality time with a tight-knit circle of close friends rather than socializing in large groups. There's a level of authenticity and emotional depth in those one-on-one interactions that I find immensely fulfilling. You can have those wonderfully candid, meandering conversations that simply aren't possible in a crowded room where you're constantly competing for attention. That's not to say I'm antisocial by any means. I thoroughly enjoy the buzz of a lively gathering from time to time, but those experiences tend to be more superficial by nature. Ultimately, I believe the most enriching friendships are those where both parties feel comfortable enough to be entirely vulnerable and unguarded with one another.
How do you usually keep in touch with friends who live far away?
I keep in touch with my friends by using social media and messaging apps like WhatsApp. We send messages to each other every day and sometimes we make video calls on weekends. I also post photos on Instagram so my friends can see what I'm doing. I think technology makes it very easy to stay connected with friends even if they live in another city or country.
I rely quite heavily on technology to maintain my friendships across distances. WhatsApp is probably my go-to platform for day-to-day communication. Quick voice notes and messages help keep things ticking along. Beyond that, I try to schedule regular video calls with my closest friends, perhaps once a fortnight, so we can have proper catch-ups rather than just exchanging brief texts. I've also found that sharing articles or funny videos with each other throughout the week is a lovely way of showing someone you're thinking of them, even when you're miles apart.
Maintaining long-distance friendships requires a fair amount of intentionality, I've found. My primary means of staying connected is through regular video calls. I've established a sort of informal tradition with my closest friends where we set aside time every couple of weeks for a proper conversation, almost like a virtual coffee date. On top of that, I make a conscious effort to send thoughtful messages or share things that remind me of them, an article they'd find fascinating, a song that captures something we've experienced together. I think what truly sustains these friendships, though, isn't merely the frequency of contact but rather the quality of engagement. Even a brief but heartfelt message can carry far more weight than hours of idle small talk.
Please begin speaking now.
I want to talk about a time when I was really happy. It was when I graduated from university last year. The ceremony was in June and it was held at the main hall of my university in the city centre. My parents and my sister came to watch me. I felt very happy because I worked really hard for 4 years and finally I got my degree. Before the ceremony, I was a bit nervous because there were many people there. But when they called my name and I walked on the stage, I felt so proud. My mother was crying because she was happy too. After the ceremony, we went to a nice restaurant and had a big dinner together. My father said he was proud of me and that made me feel even more happy. I think this was one of the best days of my life because all my hard work was worth it and my family was there to share the moment with me.
I'd like to describe a particularly memorable occasion when I felt genuinely happy, which was the day I received my acceptance letter from my first-choice university. This happened about 3 years ago, in early August, and I was at home with my parents and younger brother when the email arrived. I remember refreshing my inbox constantly that morning because the results were due to be released that day. When I finally saw the notification, I could barely believe my eyes. I'd been offered an unconditional place to study architecture, which had been my dream for as long as I could remember. The reason this made me so incredibly happy was that I'd devoted the entire previous year to preparing my portfolio and sitting the entrance examinations. There had been moments when I seriously doubted whether I was good enough, so receiving that confirmation was an enormous relief. My mother immediately rang my grandparents to share the news, and my father suggested we go out for a celebratory meal that evening. What made it even more special was that my best friend had also been accepted at the same university, so we were both over the moon. Looking back, I think that day stands out because it represented the reward for sustained effort and genuine passion.
I'd like to talk about an occasion that brought me immense happiness, and that was the day my younger sister successfully completed her final round of chemotherapy last spring. The setting was the oncology ward of the regional hospital in my hometown, and the entire family had gathered there, my parents, my grandparents on both sides, and several close family friends who had supported us throughout the ordeal. What made this particular moment so profoundly joyful was the sheer contrast with the preceding 18 months, during which our family had endured an almost unbearable level of anxiety and emotional strain. My sister had been diagnosed at just 14, and watching her cope with the grueling treatment regime had been heart-wrenching for all of us. When the consultant confirmed that her latest scans showed no remaining traces of the disease, there was a collective outpouring of relief that I struggle to put into words even now. My grandmother, who is normally remarkably composed, broke down in tears, and even the nursing staff appeared visibly moved. In the days that followed, it felt as though a tremendous weight had been lifted from the entire household. We organized a small gathering at home to mark the milestone, and I recall my sister laughing, truly laughing, for the first time in months. I suppose what made this happiness so intense and so enduring was that it wasn't rooted in personal achievement or material gain, but rather in the restoration of something infinitely precious, the health and future of someone I love dearly.
Do you think the things that make people happy have changed compared to previous generations?
Yes, I think things have changed a lot. In the past, people were happy with simple things like spending time with family or having enough food. But now, many people think they need expensive things to be happy, like new phones or designer clothes. Also, social media makes people compare themselves with others, so they are not satisfied easily. However, I think some things are still the same, like being healthy and having good friends. These things always make people happy no matter what generation they are from.
I'd say there's been a notable shift, yes, although perhaps not as dramatic as some people suggest. Previous generations tended to derive happiness from fairly tangible sources, job security, home ownership, raising a family, whereas nowadays there seems to be a growing emphasis on experiences and personal fulfillment. The rise of social media has also introduced an entirely new dimension, where people's sense of happiness is increasingly tied to external validation through likes and followers. That said, I think the fundamental human need for close relationships, purpose, and a sense of belonging has remained remarkably constant across generations, even if the ways in which we pursue those things have evolved considerably.
That's a thought-provoking question, and I think the answer is multifaceted. On the surface, it certainly appears that the sources of happiness have shifted quite dramatically. Previous generations, particularly those who lived through periods of genuine hardship such as wartime or economic depression, often found deep contentment in what we might now consider basic provisions, a stable income, a roof overhead, and the well-being of their children. Contemporary society, by contrast, seems to place far greater value on self-actualization, novel experiences, and curated lifestyles, which I believe is partly a consequence of increased material prosperity and partly driven by the pervasive influence of digital culture. However, I'd argue that beneath these surface-level changes, the underlying psychological architecture of happiness has remained largely unchanged. Research consistently demonstrates that meaningful relationships, a sense of autonomy, and contributing to something beyond oneself are the most reliable predictors of lasting well-being, regardless of era. So whilst the packaging may differ, the essence, I suspect, is remarkably similar.
Some people argue that pursuing happiness directly is counterproductive. Would you agree?
I partly agree with this idea. Sometimes when people try very hard to be happy, they feel more stressed and unhappy. For example, if someone thinks they must be happy all the time, they might feel bad when something goes wrong. I think happiness usually comes when you are doing something you enjoy or spending time with people you love, not when you are looking for it. But I also think it's good to do things that make you feel positive, like exercising or having hobbies. So I think the balance is important.
There's certainly some truth in that argument, and it's a view that's gained considerable traction in recent years. The paradox seems to be that the more consciously we chase happiness as an end goal, the more elusive it becomes, because we inevitably set unrealistic expectations and then feel disappointed when reality falls short. I think genuine happiness tends to emerge as a byproduct of living in accordance with one's values, maintaining strong social connections, and engaging in work or activities that provide a sense of meaning. That said, I wouldn't dismiss the value of intentional practices such as gratitude journaling or mindfulness, which do appear to enhance people's overall sense of well-being. So perhaps the distinction lies between obsessively pursuing happiness and taking thoughtful steps to cultivate the conditions in which it can flourish.
I find this a particularly compelling proposition, and on balance, I'm inclined to agree, albeit with certain caveats. The philosopher John Stuart Mill articulated this idea rather elegantly when he suggested that happiness must be approached obliquely, that those who focus on it directly are the least likely to attain it. There's mounting empirical support for this view as well. Studies in positive psychology have demonstrated that individuals who place excessive value on the pursuit of happiness often report lower life satisfaction, partly because they become hyper-aware of moments when they fall short of their idealized emotional state. This creates a pernicious cycle of self-monitoring and disappointment. I believe a far more productive approach is to invest one's energy in cultivating what psychologists refer to as eudaimonic well-being, the deep satisfaction that arises from purposeful engagement, personal growth, and contribution to others' lives. This form of fulfillment tends to be considerably more resilient and enduring than the fleeting hedonic pleasure that most people associate with the word happiness. That said, I wouldn't want to entirely discount the value of deliberate well-being practices. The key, I think, is intentionality without obsession.
To what extent do you think governments have a responsibility to promote the happiness of their citizens?
I think governments have some responsibility for people's happiness. They should make sure that people have basic things like healthcare, education, and safe places to live. If people don't have these things, it's very difficult to be happy. Also, governments can create parks and public spaces where people can relax and enjoy their free time. However, I don't think the government can make everyone happy because happiness is also a personal thing. Each person has different needs and wants, so the government cannot control everything. In my opinion, they should focus on giving people opportunities.
I think this is an area where governments need to strike a careful balance. On the one hand, there's a strong case for saying that the state has a fundamental obligation to create the conditions in which citizens can thrive, and that includes not just economic stability but also access to quality healthcare, education, and a clean environment. Countries like Bhutan, which have adopted gross national happiness as a policy framework, demonstrate that governments can take an active role in prioritizing well-being alongside economic growth. On the other hand, there's a legitimate concern about overreach. Happiness is deeply personal, and any attempt by the state to prescribe what constitutes a good life risks becoming paternalistic. I'd argue that the most effective approach is for governments to focus on removing barriers to well-being, poverty, inequality, discrimination, rather than attempting to engineer happiness directly.
This is a question that sits at the intersection of political philosophy and psychology, and I think the answer depends heavily on one's conception of the state's role. From a broadly liberal perspective, the government's primary obligation is to safeguard individual liberties and provide the institutional infrastructure, rule of law, public services, social safety nets, within which citizens are free to pursue their own vision of a fulfilling life. Viewed through this lens, the state's responsibility extends to ensuring equitable access to the prerequisites of well-being rather than prescribing happiness itself. However, there is an increasingly influential counterargument, championed by economists such as Richard Laird, which contends that governments should actively measure and target subjective well-being as a policy objective, much as they currently target GDP growth or inflation. I find this perspective persuasive to a degree, particularly when it draws attention to often neglected determinants of happiness such as mental health provision, community cohesion, and work-life balance. Nevertheless, I would sound a note of caution. Any governmental attempt to define or quantify happiness inevitably involves value judgments that may not reflect the diversity of human experience. Ultimately, I believe the most enlightened approach is one in which governments create fertile ground for happiness to take root organically, without presuming to dictate the shape it should take.
Before you go, don't forget to like this video, share it with other test takers, and subscribe so you never miss your daily IELTS and CELPEP tests. Drop your score in the comments. Your name could be featured in our monthly Achievers newsletter. Stay consistent, stay focused, and keep leveling up with MasterPrep.